What happened to the 2023 Singapore Grand Prix? It's the first weekend in the entirety of the 2023 season in which Red Bull did not win a race, and we're going to talk about all of it starting right now. What's going on, guys? Welcome back. The Singapore Grand Prix weekend was one of the most exciting we've seen so far this year, if only because the Red Bull team really seemed to struggle the most. It seems like they have since Brazil of last year, and so it provided a lot of entertainment value and provided a chance for a new race winner. We're going to go over it all, but first, if you are an F1 fan, go ahead, hit that subscribe button down below, turn on notifications so you don't miss a single upload. We do a lot of F1 content here, as well as F1 gaming content and real life. So go ahead, hit subscribe, join the community, and let's go ahead and jump on into this recap of the Singapore Grand Prix weekend. We're going to talk about the race quick hits, some bullet points to cover everything, my weekend winners and losers, and we'll round things out with going over the predictions that I made before the weekend began. Spoiler alert, did not do very good, but let's go ahead, let's jump on into it. We'll get things started by going over my race quick hits, some bullet points from how the race ended up. And we'll start off with, I think, the overarching theme of this entire weekend. This is how amazing F1 would be if Red Bull just simply didn't exist. We saw, going into basically every session, not quite sure who would be topping each individual session, and even into the end of the race in the final, 4 or 5 laps, there were 4 cars all within 2 seconds of each other battling for the win. This was one of the most exciting finishes to a race we've seen this year, or maybe even going back to certain points of last year, and it was so much fun to see, and I hope we get more of these kinds of things in the future. Not that I'm wishing too much ill will on Red Bull. Obviously, they deserve the success they've had so far this season. They've managed to build the best car, and that should be rewarded. But this is how much fun we could be having if they were just struggling just a little bit more, is all I'm saying. Carlos Sainz ends up winning the Singapore Grand Prix. He has been on an absolute terrific run of form recently. I believe it was ever since the end of the summer break, he has been showing some absolute top form. And even compared to his own teammate, Charles Leclerc, he's been running even better. He pulls off the first non-Red Bull win this season, and he looked very, very impressive doing it. It might be one of the most impressive races that we've seen from Carlos Sainz, and he managed the race from the beginning to the end, purposefully slowing the race down to keep, those undercuts and overcuts under control. He ended up down the stretch of the race, letting Lando Norris back into DRS to help defend from the 2 Mercedes who were making a charge. And at the end of the day, he ends up taking pole and converting it to a win. So what a weekend. Carlos, congratulations. What a race for you, and it was so much fun to watch. On the flip side, Charles playing the team game in this one, I think was very, very impressive to see from him. I think it was pretty obvious that Carlos definitely had the measure of the pace this weekend. And Charles, apparently it was talked about after the race that it kind of had been the plan to try and use him as much as he can to protect Carlos and bring a win for Ferrari this year. So I applaud you, Charles Leclerc. I'm sure it was a very frustrating weekend to be kind of behind Charles the whole time. He had a great start starting on softs, but then kind of just got very unlucky with timing of the safety cars and just being caught out on the wrong tires at the wrong time. So it doesn't quite end up for him at the end, but he does help secure a Ferrari win in a season in which only Red Bull and now Ferrari have won a race. So I applaud you, sir. Lando Norris P2 after holding off both McLarens on fresher tires was very impressive. Both Mercedes decided to pit with a large window behind to put on a fresh set of mediums for both drivers, and they ended up actually catching the front 2 with about 4 or 5 laps remaining, and he was able to, with some help from Carlos Sainz slowing down and giving him DRS, able to hold off the Mercs on much fresher tires. And yeah, it was a fantastically run race by Lando. I think if he had I don't know if there was a path for him to win. I mean, Singapore is famously not known for its overtaking. But with the new layout, which I actually really loved, by the way, I think it gave a little bit of hope. But down the stretch, I think the tires were a little too dead, and there just wasn't quite enough pace in that McLaren compared to the Ferrari of Carlos. And so Lando's win wasn't quite there, but it's very solid P2 nonetheless. Very, very well done by the McLaren driver. I think one of the biggest talking points for the weekend is going to have been Mercedes. It seems like they made all the right calls at all the right times, and besides one mistake right at the death by George, They ran almost, I think, a perfect weekend for them. George was primed for a podium before his unfortunate crash at literally the last lap. And Lewis, I think, had a lot of pace in him. And I think one of the bigger what ifs in terms of Mercedes fans is going to be what if George had, allowed Lewis through. I say allowed. I saw a lot of discourse on this after the race as well about people saying that George should have let Lewis through to, challenge for a win. Lewis had incredible pace on that last set of tires. And really, that's just going to be the biggest what if here is what if Lewis had been there in third chasing down Lando and Carlos. It seemed like he had the pace, and at the end of the day, it's just a what if, unfortunately. Briefly touching back on Red Bull, it seems like they got really caught out on safety car timing, both the full safety car and the VSCs later in the race, and so it turned out to be one of their toughest weekends in a very long time. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's going to happen to some teams, and it's glad to see that Red Bull really is, mortal after all. They do bleed. And we've got to see them kind of have a weekend where not everything went their way. Although there was some moments there where Max Verstappen avoided some penalties from qualifying thanks to having a sister team, and that sister team being the recipient of those penalties. And so there's a lot of conversations to be had about that, but we're not going to go there right now. Piastri finishing in the points after starting P17. Massive result for him. Not a whole lot really to say. I think he played his cards very, very well considering the retirements, the safety cars, and kind of managed his race very nicely to finish in the points. Liam Lawson, got to give a special shout out to Liam Lawson. He finishes in the points in only his third F1 race of his career. He ran a beautiful race. He ends up knocking out Max Verstappen in Q2 in qualifying to make his first Q3 appearance. It was a very, very good weekend if you're a Liam Lawson fan, and he should be absolutely commended for his results. Let's go. Haas points. It may be a point, but hey, Haas points is always going to be celebrated here. After getting a double Q3 start, I think everyone was kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, the tires to fall off a cliff, and to then finish, somewhere in the 15th to 18th range. Kevin Magnussen is one of probably the biggest beneficiary of the George Russell retirement on the last lap. But we are not going to look a gift horse in the mouth when it comes to Haas points. Kevin Magnussen, you earned it. Good points. Fantastic weekend for you. It's been nice run of form this weekend to see you have a little bit of edge over Nico Hülkenberg in this one. So absolutely, let's keep it up. Let's keep pushing. Japan points, maybe, probably not, but maybe. Who knows? But I think my last point really is, after seeing a full weekend of Red Bull struggling, I think we're now all expecting a return to form in Japan, unfortunately. And we're just going to have to remember these moments and hold on to them and cherish them for as long as we can. But guys, that was my race quick hits. What did you think of the race? Let me know down in the comments below. Did I miss anything from my quick hits? I typically only really touched on most of the top 10 and kind of the big points, but let me know what I missed down in the comments below. But let's go ahead. Let's move on to my weekend winners and losers. Moving on to the weekend winners and losers, we're going to start with my weekend winner, and I really went back and forth on this, and I actually changed it literally right before I started recording this. We'll start with my original answer with Liam Lawson. He ran an absolutely beautiful weekend, knocking Max Verstappen out of Q2 on his way to his first Q3 appearance, as well as his first points appearance in F1. I wanted to give a special shout out to Liam. He ran an absolutely beautiful race, the beneficiary of another George Russell retirement to finish P9. Absolutely wonderfully done in that AlphaTauri, especially when you compare it to Yuki Tsunoda, who unfortunately had to retire effectively at the beginning of the race. So congratulations, Liam, on your finish. But my weekend winner is actually going to be Carlos Sainz. I went back and forth between him and Liam the most, and I think Carlos is ultimately going to be my pick for weekend winner, just because he ran probably one of the most well-managed races that I've seen in Formula One. Basically, from the jump, they had a strategy of keeping the pack relatively together, really not allow any of the quote-unquote faster cars, aka the Red Bulls, to really overcut or undercut them. They really managed the race from the start. They managed the pace, pushed when he needed to, relaxed when he needed to. Ferrari managed to not completely mess up strategy too much for Carlos, at least. Charles, unfortunately, was the loser on a particular double stack on the first safety car. But Carlos, basically, I think he led from almost, lap one to the finish line. And so it was an absolutely beautifully done weekend by Carlos. Takes pole, ends up with the win. Carlos, congratulations. You are my pick for weekend winner. And unfortunately for every weekend winner, there must also be a weekend loser. And this is another one I went back and forth on a lot. But my choice ends up being George Russell. He makes a couple of millimeter mistake, tapping a wall on the final lap of the race to lose a podium and actually lose points altogether. He ran a very, very great race. He did kind of fall off the pace a little bit when it came to catching Carlos and Lando on fresh tires with Lewis behind. But at the end of the day, on the final lap of the Grand Prix, he taps a wall a little too hard. My theory is that he broke his steering column. You can see him and he's going straight, trying to turn, but nothing ends up happening. And unfortunately having to retire in the barriers. A very, very unfortunate result for George. He was effectively, distraught after the race was over. You could really see the emotion of what that race meant and what it took to get to that point just for one small mistake with only a handful of corners to go to lose out. And so it wasn't for any particular reason, but I think just circumstances abound. Losing a podium like that, George, I'm sorry, but you're my weekend loser. We'll wrap things up in this video by going over the predictions results, my predictions I make before every race weekend, and see how I did. And we're gonna start off with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went for Zhou Guanyu. I thought that him potentially having a new Alfa Romeo contract, in which later was confirmed that he had a new contract before the weekend began, was going to propel him forward to one of his better weekends in the sport. Unfortunately, that Alfa Romeo definitely didn't seem like it worked all too well. And while he did end up finishing P12 in the race, I don't think he was the biggest positive surprise as compared to someone like Carlos Sainz or Liam Lawson. And so unfortunately, I'm starting out 0 for 1 as we move forward to my pick for biggest disappointment. And I really struggled with giving myself a half point here or not, but I chose Alpine. The retirement of Esteban Ocon was disappointing, but Pierre finishing P6 off the back of a not great performance last weekend out. I don't think I could give myself a half point. The Esteban retirement was reliability related, and while that is disappointing, Pierre finishing P6 in this year, that high up for an Alpine is always a solid result for the French outfit. So unfortunately, I am over 1 on that one as well, and over 2 overall. And now comes the biggest shocker, I think, of them all, my qualifying results. To go over what my original qualifying choices were, I had Sergio Perez taking pole, Max Verstappen taking P2, and Lewis Hamilton taking P3. Unfortunately, I went 0 for 3 on those qualifying selections, and it was almost as bad as it gets with both Red Bulls out in Q2 and Lewis qualifying not near the top 3 per se. Obviously, Carlos ends up taking pole. George also up there as well as Lando. It was very wrong, and it's probably the most wrong of qualifying I've been all year long. And so now I am 0 at 5 so far in my predictions. I warned you at the top that it was not going to be pretty, and so far it is not. Now for my podium predictions, and you're going to notice something else as well. I had a Max Verstappen win, a Sergio Perez P3, and a Lewis Hamilton P2. So here is my rule for those of you who are new. If I guess someone on the podium and they're in the top 3 but in the wrong spot, I give myself a half point for them being there. So I selected Max Verstappen win, Lewis P2, Sergio P3. Obviously, neither Red Bull finishes on the podium. Lewis ends up taking P3 after the George Russell retirement. So a half point out of 3, and I am officially on the board with a half point out of 8 so far on this one as we move to my final prediction I make, and it is my Haas prediction of the race weekend. And here's where I'm being a little generous with myself, because you gotta be a little bit generous when you're talking about Haas results. My predictions before the weekend began were 1 car into Q2 and both cars finish. That's pretty good. Singapore is brutal on both drivers and cars. Who knows what was gonna happen? And I tell you what, both cars finished. Point, ding, ding. And this is where I'm being extra generous to myself. Obviously, both cars made it into Q3, probably beyond my wildest imagination and dreams. And so I did give myself that point, but I did leave a lot of points potentially on the table if I could have been a little more bold and seen some of this happening. But who would have predicted this going into the weekend? We're just going to enjoy the ride along the way. So those of you keeping track on as we went down them, I end up with a very, very cool 2.5 points out of 10 total, and it did not go well. 10? Did I do that math wrong? I might have done that math wrong. 2, 5, 8, 11. No, 10. Don't second guess yourselves. I did this math earlier. Don't second guess yourselves out there. You know, trust your gut, trust your instinct. You did it right the first time. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, not even yourself. But obviously not a good weekend for me in terms of predictions. Hopefully we'll come back out and be a little more productive in Japan. But I, for one, am excited to see it. But that wraps up my predictions here. Let's go ahead. Let's wrap this thing up. Guys, that wraps up our race weekend here in Singapore for the Singapore Grand Prix. What did you think of the race? I think it was one of the best we've seen this year, and I don't think it's particularly close. Congratulations once again to Carlos on his win, Lando on his P2, and Lewis on his P3. Congrats again to Liam Lawson for his points, as well as W for Haas, multiple cars into Q3 and a points finish for Haas. I'm never going to complain about that. F1 moves on to Japan, not but a week from now. I'm excited to see what they have in store for us out there. Japan is always one of my favorites to see. I really enjoyed it last year, even though the weather was absolutely insane, but I'm excited to see it this year. But yeah, we'll be back again early next week for some more predictions as well as some other videos, so stay tuned for that. Once again, hit subscribe. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Singapore, what you're looking forward to in Japan. But for now, that's going to wrap it up for me here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.